2 years ago, during the largest solar eclipse in 38 years at the Washington, D.C. ACS, to quite a bit of fanfare, we unveiled something new. And at the time, at least the zeitgeist of the time, which remains today still the case, sustainability, economies of synthesis were all at, of course, the forefront of the way we like to think about organic chemistry. And even during an eclipse, there's still something you have a lot of, and that's electrons. It's the cheapest thing you've got, and it's the easiest way to do a redox reaction. It's the most sustainable form of redox chemistry you can actually imagine. And as I'll mention in a moment, some of the largest industrial processes on planet Earth are done using electrochemistry. Now, before I begin and tell you a little bit about the history of this and what we're going to unveil today, let me just make a shout out, of course, to the founder and CEO of EICA, René Stiegelmann, who, of course, without his vision, none of this would be possible, because this project was born about 5 years ago because of his vision and dedication to what would be a momentous engineering endeavor. So where did it begin? Well, like most people who get into the area of electrochemistry, it's not by choice. It's by desperation. And we got into this because of a total synthesis project that had gone awry and could not be accomplished using any known chemical transformation. And so we went out of desperation and found out that using constant potential, we could get this dimeric natural product to form. And it was our own ignorance, of course, that we didn't realize how important electrochemistry is to all of the organic processes that are out there currently, and many of which are industrially viable on enormous scales. For example, some of the most inexpensive commodity materials out there are made using electrochemistry. Often when people ask, well, if you can do something electrochemically, how are you going to scale it up? It's kind of the last question you need to ask when you're talking about electrochemistry, because the industrial infrastructure to translate small scale into large scale, that expertise already exists. So for example, a fragrance which probably all of you have traces of it on your body at the moment, Lismoral, is made, I visited this facility with Siggy in April of this year, is made on metric ton scale through an electrochemical anodic oxidation process. And that facility, as you might imagine, smells great. It's like flowers. And Lismoral is actually in many of your soaps and shampoos. It's kind of everywhere. And it's made through an electrochemical process. And most people don't realize just how all-pervasive this type of chemistry is. So electrochemistry, of course, is synonymous with sustainability. But as I'll mention over and over again, that's not enough. Appealing to people's basic desire to be good to the planet is not enough to actually encourage organic chemists to look in this area. And so where this began was a collaboration, a translation, so to speak, between engineers and synthetic organic chemists. Roughly 5 years ago, René and his team visited Scripps in this building on the 4th floor and said, hey, it would be great if we could somehow collaborate. And those of you who know our lab, we never really turned down a collaboration, but weren't really sure how we would collaborate with a company that makes stirring plates. So we went to the lab and showed them what we had in mind, and René's eyes sort of sparked up and realized there's something special there. Now, the history of synthetic organic electrochemistry is quite vast, and like photochemistry, there's enormous advances over the years and amazing chemical reactions that are out there. And if you draw a timeline of some of these reactions, you'll note that many of them find their ways into organic textbooks, but usually recapitulated with chemical reagents. And the electrochemical underpinnings or origins of those reactions are rarely discussed, despite the fact that it is vast and somewhat beautiful. A lot of creative events there, and continuing to this day at an unabated pace. If you contrast that, though, with advances in engineering, it's quite remarkably disparate, in that the main engineering advances made for synthetic organic chemistry pretty much ended around 1950. Now, EICA has electrochemistry in their DNA. They actually made one of the first potentiostats commercially. They commercialized it back in, I think, 1950-something. They sold it for a few years and then abruptly stopped. It looked like a large cappuccino machine. People can't buy that anymore. You can buy smaller potentiostats, but at the time, that was kind of the state of the art. But the innards of those machines had pretty much remained exactly the same. So how do you make electrochemistry mainstream? Well, it depends who you ask. Some people are going to say, it's already mainstream. But who is it mainstream for? Well, the audiences are quite bifurcated. And as I mentioned before, you've got this series of people in the battery industry, analytical divisions. Those people know electrochemistry really well. And you've got people making commodity chemicals, whether it be aluminum or polymers or chlorine or hydroxide or some of the intermediates I showed you before. Those people are also well versed in the art and science of electrochemistry. But then there's a large and vast audience of people like the ones in this building and the ones in pharma who really have no clue how they could possibly use electrochemistry or maybe even why there is any kind of provocative use case for it. And those people have been left behind. Whereas industry is focused on the former and the latter, those middle section of people who think about natural products, pharmaceuticals, and fragrances and food additives, largely, they don't usually consider electrochemistry as a part of their day-to-day activities. And we wondered back in 2014, in the context of that total synthesis, why exactly is that? Now, electrochemistry has something to offer that goes beyond sustainability and hugging trees. There's also reactivity that you can access in very simple ways that you often can't get using chemical reagents. I think when Kawa talks later on today, he'll give a very interesting summary of some of the types of reactions that we view as being forcing functions for the use of electrochemistry that will actually require certain people in context to embrace this type of interesting reactivity. So what is it then that's holding back electrochemistry from society embracing it? It really comes down to three main things. And the first of which is just a perception that electrochemistry is a kind of alien technology. It's not that ET, though. It's just electron transfer. So if you understand basic physical organic chemistry, you can understand how electrons move and oxidation taking place on an anode and reduction taking place on a cathode. And today, for the E-curious among you, we'll have 3 really great lectures on intros to electrochemistry if you don't already know this area well. The second problem is a stark reality, and one that we sought to fix in collaboration with ICA, and that is the fact that the way of putting electrochemical apparatuses together is very similar to if you had to build your own iPhone every time you wanted to send a text message. People probably wouldn't be using those devices as much if that were to be the case. And so, as I'll talk about in a moment, the situation from an equipment standpoint was simply a non-starter for 99% of the people who actually do organic chemistry in the mainstream world. The third problem is partly reality and partly perception, and that is maybe the reactivity is just not interesting enough. That is to say, if you were to tell a medicinal chemist at a large pharma company that, hey, instead of using chromium to oxidize your alcohol, you can do this with electrochemistry, they'll roll their eyes and say, you know, I like trees, but I like my job better. And so they'll continue to use the chromium because they have no desire to get a PhD in arts and crafts to set up a device to do a simple thing like a alcohol oxidation. I think what is needed here is something which is more sexy. For example, a really good analogy can be made to the advent of electric cars. Nobody really wanted to own these. Only the most environmentally pious of us would ever think about owning one of these cars until it was made into something that was cool. So I think a similar thing can be said here for the actual equipment and the actual reactions that are invented. There has to be an actual need where you can say, yes, electrochemistry actually has some benefit, and here's a reason, a forcing function to actually institute it into our own work. Okay, so as I mentioned, you do need quite a list of things to get started in electrochemistry. And the problem with this is it is rather anecdotal in nature. Everybody has their favorite electrode source. Everybody has their favorite potentiostat supplier. And after that, you have to get out your soldering iron, your riveting gun, do some glass blowing, and come up with your own apparatus, tediously detail that in the SI, and then hope that your chemistry is interesting enough that someone in the world will be willing to recapitulate your device and try out the same chemistry in their laboratory. And we have already about 80 years of data to suggest that that is never going to happen. So back in 2017, I would give lectures about electrochemistry at companies and say, who here has ever done an electrochemical reaction? And nobody would ever raise their hand, because this is simply too much of an energy barrier to go over for anyone in a company to actually institute this type of chemistry, regardless of how interesting it might be. If you have a field which is anecdotal and balkanized, and you need to go on eBay to buy different supplies, it's never going to take off. It will remain a boutique science, despite its potential. And so, several years ago, we collaborated with ICA, and they hired a dozen engineers, and the idea was, let's invent a potentiostat that would be standardized. And let's raise the bar. Let's also invent a CV, or analytical device. And because we're all chemists, we kind of need a stirring plate, so let's also put that in there as well. And the idea is that these would not be fragmented devices that you would need to buy 3 of and saturate your hood with the various equipment, but rather the potentiostat, the analytical device, and the stirring plate would not be separate, segregated devices, but rather they would be one device. And in doing that, you would simplify the entire picture, and ElectraSyn was born back in 2017. This is ElectraSyn. Some of you probably own the device, and maybe some of you are interested in the future in getting it. One of the key things of this, when we talked to Rene, is I explained to him that chemists are, to put it, because this is being filmed, to put it in a very politically correct way, they are economically conservative. And so it's very difficult to convince a practicing organic chemist to spend $5,000 to $15,000 on a new device to do this. So the key thing was, first, ICA can't make much money. And he agreed to that. And so these were sold at the price of about the same price you would pay for a stirring plate. So the features of ElectraSyn back in 2017 were quite vast, and I think they were kind of forward-looking for their time in terms of a normal normal laboratory device that you can purchase today. It had a number of features which I think still today there is no competition out there. And just as a baseline, of course, there was a potentiostat. I don't know what happened here. There was, of course, a potentiostat. You need that in order to do electrochemistry. But the key was you can't take up half of your hood in order to do this. So we had to take the computer and the stirring plate. And the real estate in a common organic laboratory hood is even more expensive than real estate in La Jolla. And so you can't have a super enormous device, or no one is ever going to use this. So we needed to pack everything we needed in the size of a normal ICA stir plate. So there's a normal ICA stir plate, and that's your real estate in using an ElectraSyn, same size. And of course, we needed to have the capabilities of all modern potentiostats built into that. And we also needed to have, of course, a user interface that would draw people into the experience of electrochemistry in a very calming and exciting way, to make it enjoyable for people who had never done electrochemistry before. Built into the device was a magical little elf, not as annoying as the paperclip in Microsoft Word, that would tell you how to set up these reactions for those of you who had never done it before. We called it Smart Assist, and that has been a very popular feature. And then for people who already knew how to do electrochemistry, of course, you didn't need to use that helper. It was just very easy and intuitive to inject as many electrons as you wanted, either constant potential or constant current. So it needed to be beautiful, it needed to be easy to use, it needed to have analytical capabilities, because as you'll hear in the lectures later today, cyclic voltammetry is a fantastic way to understand these reactions and find out what the potential that you want to dial in should be. So these CVs can be taken effortlessly in roughly a third of the time it takes you to run a TLC. So they're extremely rapid, and they can be imported to your computer, or as I'll show you in a moment, even your phone. Standardization is important. You don't want to go to nebulous suppliers online to find different electrodes. You'd rather just go to one source. And so ICA sells dozens of different electrodes that have all sorts of materials that you would need. And so you don't need to worry about what your current density is going to be, and if your current density is going to match the apparatus of the person who's reproducing your reaction in a different continent. It's all standardized from the electrode size to the volume of the reactor. And of course, modularity was quite important, because we viewed ElectraSyn as only the beginning. This is the baseline device, and we wanted on that, of course, the capability of having everything you need set up from a standard single cell, as shown here. Of course, you'd want to do more than one reaction, And so we promised back in 2017 that we would be releasing a carousel that would give you feelings that reminded you of the merry-go-round when you were a child. And indeed, this is a fun accessory that was available now for the past year or so. It's not coming soon anymore. And if you said, you know what, I'm done with electrochemistry, just don't want to do it anymore, you don't lose all your money because you can just attach to the top of it a stirring plate. And all of the stirring plate, of course, is included. And the device actually morphs itself into a standard ICA stirring plate. And so this enables all of the canonical types of electrochemical reactions you might want to do. And of course, we needed to future-proof it because we don't want chemists to keep buying more and more devices. ICA's business model is not to force people to buy new equipment because it breaks or becomes obsolete. So the idea is you would buy it and it would never become obsolete for as long as the company exists. So I'll show you just what we mean by that in a moment. And then connectivity. In order to future-proof the device, obviously it needs to be connectable to through various means, whether that's Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or just through a USB. And then, of course, you want an app, because everything these days has an app. Even your refrigerator and maybe even utensils have apps these days. So you needed that. And so we promised after the shipment of ElectraSyn that an app would be forthcoming. And I'll show you just what progress has been made in that regard. And then finally, of course, we wanted to stick by it with a forever warranty, which Renee agreed to. So if these ever break, ICA doesn't make any money fixing broken equipment. It's in their best interest to make something that will last forever. All right. So what's been the reception? It's been out now for 2 years. These things started shipping pretty much in massive quantity back in January of 2018. And there's roughly 1,000 of these things in the wild already. Looking at the list, I'm not able to identify any company on the planet that is, small or large, that does chemistry, that does not have one of these devices on their shelf. And the important thing about this is for the academician, not for the industrial user. What I mean by that is if you're an academician and you're inventing a new electrochemical reaction, and you show that it can work in ElectraSyn, you no longer need to go to the tedium of convincing them how to set up an electrochemical apparatus. Just like if you're doing a microwave reaction, you don't have to tell people how to build their own microwave. So all of this is now built in. The industrial utility can be immediately seen by having these devices in those companies. And what about the sort of academic community? Well, over the past year and a half, there's been well over 30, 40 pretty good papers that have come out that have been using, in their supporting information you can see highlighted, procedures that take advantage of ElectraSyn. And I show some of the screenshots of these papers here. And in visiting various companies, what they have told me is it's very desirable for them when they see a paper on electrochemistry to have an ElectraSyn procedure in the SI because it allows them to instantly reproduce it without any tedium or havoc. And then in the Twitter community, it has been embraced quite well. We picked up a bunch of screenshots of people that are really enjoying the device because it's actually quite pretty. I promised during the keynote event 2 years ago that I would buy one for my house. I did. It's really pretty and the kids loved it. But then the lab became so enamored with the device, they begged me to bring that one in. So I don't have one at home anymore. And the kids often ask, where is it? So maybe I'll have to buy another one. Okay, so we are really, ICA is really dedicated to customer feedback and improving upon the device. And so back in around 2016 or so, ICA actually set up a site here in San Diego called ICAWorks as a kind of call out to the famous, I think it was Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman that had Skunkworks. This is ICAWorks. So it's a secret facility behind a guard gate, about 5 minutes walking distance from here, where engineers are working around the clock to develop new advances for ElectraSyn and new electrochemical apparatus. And so what have they been doing based on customer feedback? Well, over the past couple of years, the first thing people said is, you know what, we want a way to do these reactions on smaller scale. So we invented microelectrodes, an entire suite of microelectrodes and microvials that allow people to do even very tiny scale. Carousel was something we promised during the keynote, and shortly thereafter, we actually rolled it out. It's been selling really well. Allows people to screen reactions 6 at a time, and also scale up reactions. If you want to do these things on multi-gram scale, you can do that as well. And there was a publication recently where just that was done. And then finally, folks had said, we want to do our electrochemical reactions at minus 78. It's rare. Most of the reactions are done at room temperature. We want to do it minus 78, or we'd like to try to sonicate these reactions, and it'd be neat if you could extend it. So as a call out to Inspector Gadget, with his GoGo modules, we invented the GoGo module for ElectraSyn, where you could now move your reaction setup anywhere you want, whether it's a cryogenic, or it's a heating up event, or sonication. The GoGo module allows you to do that. So what are we here for to celebrate the second anniversary of ElectraSyn? Before I get into that, maybe I should just mention what this picture is about. These three products actually have something in common. All of them can be updated over the air. And I think that's something we've come to expect as consumers, but most laboratory apparatuses don't let you do that. But ElectraSyn does. And so over the years, the software development team at ICA has done a remarkable job of taking the initial user experience. So you purchase this device, let's say in 2017, and shortly thereafter, about a year later, the software had come to the point where now you could run a CV without doing the sort of annoying process shown on the left of having to look for the USB port, find the USB, put it in there, save the file by tediously using the switch on the front to put in the name of the file. On the right-hand side, you see we're pretty much already done. The CV has been obtained. It goes right to the screen of your phone. You save the image file, and then you email it to whoever you want. You can email it to your loved ones. I think they'd like it better than maybe a picture of the beach. Certainly interesting. So you see here, you've taken a process which was, about 10 minutes long and kind of laborious, not really in line with what we expect from a consumer product in 2019, and turn it into something that is actually really simple and quite enjoyable. Okay, so what are we talking about today? Well, three things. We're going to reveal a new form of saran wrap. No, just kidding. But these three images are iconic for what we're going to be unveiling today, that the engineers at ICA have been working amazingly hard to bring to you. And they represent sort of three key features of what we take for granted in society, things like being able to seal your device, dividing lines that keep cars from colliding to each other. Might want a way to do that with electrons. And then finally, one of my favorite things, a beehive. So what does it have to do with ElectraSyn? Well, let's talk about the first issue. So what common consumer problem with ElectraSyn was they would do these reactions. Most of the reactions we do in our lab don't need any sealing at all. They're fine to be exposed to air. Even things like birch reduction is no problem. However, many customers said, we can't seal these things. The vial is not sealed. And so when we try to put a balloon there, we come back in the morning and that's the image that we see. That was a problem. And so the way we solved it was rather kind of ghetto style of sealing it up with Teflon and parafilm. And then in the morning, you could finally have a balloon that still withstood the elements. But that's really not an ideal solution at all. So the ICA engineers have worked on a product that we call the ICA ProSeal. So it doesn't require any extra real estate. The only difference that you'll see in the normal cap that you used before is the little yellow top. And the innards of this, I think, are the subject of a patent. And now this device can hold even a vacuum overnight. If you don't want to use your glove box, which some people have been using ElectraSyn in the glove box, you don't need to do that anymore. You can use Schlenk level technique with ElectraSyn now. So that's ICA ProSeal. And it is available right now. What about divided cell? Just like you don't want cars to hit each other on a two-lane road, you probably don't want, sometimes, your electrons to hit each other. And conventionally, the way people do divided cell chemistry is shown here. This doesn't look like something you'd want to use in 2019, does it? I mean, this is expensive. You need tools to put it. It's got alligator clips. I mean, alligator clips? Really? They're still doing this. And so we needed to fix this problem. Many people said, we need a divided cell. We have very rarely done divided cell chemistry in our laboratory. It happened once during a total synthesis from 2018 where we were doing a cyclization. And you'll notice what we did was kind of tragic to ElectraSyn if you see how we bastardized the device by appending on the top here this divided cell and using alligator clips to adopt it to a divided cell. That certainly is not a solution that is in line with the beauty of the device. So today, I'd like to reveal to you ProDivide. So the ICA ProDivide fits in the same exact site as before. There are no tools needed. It stays completely sealed, and I can take it apart with my hands just by opening this part here and then gently pulling it apart, and there's your divided cell. And in there is 2 stirring bars. And if I want to change the membrane, I can program the membrane just by unscrewing this here and then pulling it apart, and the membrane comes free, and you can choose whatever you want, whether it be Teflon, Nafion, glass frit, whatever you like. And then when you're done, you just put it right back on and then set up your device in the standard way. So that's the Pro Divide. No more glass, no more misery of dealing with a normal divided cell of the type that was invented back in the 1800s. So the third product I'd like to show you, which is a little bit special, is really inspired by, first go back through history. We had, a single vial attachment. You could do 1 reaction at a time. You had 6, but people are always asking for more. And this is what really stuck in my head. Everybody, bees are great. And if you look at their house, they have phenomenal high throughput reaction cells built into their homes. And we thought that beehive is a phenomenal blueprint for what we really want in a high throughput screening device for ElectraSyn. Really what we wanted to do was take a honeycomb, put some wires and an alligator clip on there, and then do chemistry in the honeycomb. But we found very quickly that the materials of the honeycomb are not conducive to things like dichloromethane and DMF. So we needed something that was a little bit different. And that's where the ICA engineers came in. So the challenge of this, which took several years, in fact, the development of this even began before ElectraSyn itself was done, was to build an attachment that can let you do 24 reactions at a time. We want all the contacts to be safe. You can't lose your solvent and have it go into another chamber. That's a problem. It has to be very easy and to clean and to use. It has to be intuitive, and it has to be really pretty. So today, on the occasion of the 2nd anniversary of ElectraSyn, I'd like to present to you the ICA e-Hive. So the e-Hive is really cool, and there it is. It doesn't take up any extra real estate. If you notice, in the vertical direction is all it takes. It doesn't hang over the device itself, and it's really easy to take off. So there it is. It's really small, tiny. How do you open it? Well, you just press it. Clicks open, and there's your 24 reactions. And each of the 6 rows here are flanked by 4 different vials. And each of these vials is actually where the reaction takes place. And you might wonder, well, where are the electrodes? Well, there's one electrode here. The other electrode is the vial. That's how we solve this problem. Now, you might also be wondering, well, how do you monitor all 24 of these reactions? That must be a real challenge. But the incredible software design team at ICA also figured out how to do that. So you can monitor the current of all 24 reactions as they take place in real time. In the future, through software updates, you'll be able to monitor this on your phone while you're sitting at the beach, if you want, and see how the reactions are going. So what is the use of this? Why has everyone been asking for this? Everywhere I've gone for the past 2 years, the first question at the end, especially in industry, was, we want to do high throughput. How do you do 20 or 30 reactions in one fell swoop? So what is the use case? Well, back in 2017, we invented a reaction using ElectraSyn known as the nickel mediated or catalyzed electrochemical amination. Because, of course, CN cross-coupling is quite useful. And so we thought this would be a good way for medicinal chemists to be introduced to electrochemistry. So fast forward now 2 years, in collaboration with the Mintier group, the White group, the Anderson group, through the NSF Center, we found out how to improve this reaction from its 1st generation conditions to the 2nd generation conditions through a process that Kawa will speak about later this afternoon, and the mechanistic studies he'll also talk about. And we were able to translate this reaction to something that can be done on a huge scale and can even be applied in natural product synthesis. And the companies I've been to, I've shared emails with some of the people who invented this reaction, are actually miraculous in that it can actually facilitate CN cross-couplings that don't work very well with the canonical Ullmann, Buchwald, Hartwig type reaction system. So it's actually a cheap and easy way to do amination and it works sometimes where those fancy pre-catalysts actually don't. So this is a collaboration with, as I mentioned, these very talented faculty. Shelley's with us today. You'll see here later on. Of course, funded by the NSF and the Center for Synthetic Organic Electrochemistry. So how do you use e-Hive with the amination? Let's imagine you want to screen a bunch of amines. So retrospectively, if we didn't know about the second generation conditions, here's how the first and second generation conditions perform in the e-Hive. You'll see here we've got 24 set up. On the top rows, we've got different amines versus different aryl bromides with the first generation conditions versus the second generation conditions. And here's what it looks like. After a run, you charge your amines and your aryl halide in there. You charge the solvent. There's your electrode. You close the door. You let it go, and after a few hours, that's the result. You'll notice under the first generation conditions, it's mostly failure, whereas in the second generation conditions, it's a preponderance of reactions that are working. That's what the e-Hive excels at, reaction discovery. If you find a green spot, something that's good, you can then take it to the single vial or the carousel to scale up and find out how to optimize further. But this is great for reaction discovery. So let's show you an example of that we did just last night. So on this interesting journal we started called Chem Tweet Chem back in July 2019, we tweeted out this interesting paper from Goosen Group who did electrochemical cyanation through the intermediacy of a radical cation. And we showed that you could do the same reaction using ElectraSyn in a carousel, and that the nucleophiles we added in the cyanide here were all comparable yield to the Goosen paper. So we went to Kawa and Charles went to the stockroom in Scripps and scoured a variety of different nucleophiles, both organic and inorganic, in the e-Hive to see what hit. And in the morning, that's the TLC. And what we found were two of those reactions actually work pretty well. And they are reactions that are already known already with chemical oxidants. But it's an example of how one could very rapidly, in a matter of an overnight period instead of a week-long fishing expedition, find out the answer to the question of which nucleophiles might be the best to intercept this radical cation intermediate. So e-Hive is a way to facilitate and enable rapid discovery. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Today I talked about sort of a background of how ElectraSyn came into being. It's a constant evolution. ICA is committed to it, and so when you own one of these, you can only expect it to get better. Over the past couple of years, we've introduced the microvial, the carousel, the extension, and today we're going to have on display for you to play with as much as you want. The SureSeal will have engineers on site if you have specific questions about the materials used, whatever they can reveal from the patent, I assume. As well as the divided cell, we'll let you play with that. Many of you have been requesting that over the past couple of years. And then finally, the gorgeous e-Hive is available for you to play with to your heart's content. So with that, all that remains is the acknowledgments of the amazing engineers at ICA. I want to call out especially Dirk, who has led the team, including Santiago, Shobin, Eric, Charles, Pedro, Scott, Brian, Franco, and of course our own Kawal, who you'll hear from later today, who has spent his time studiously going back and forth between the secret ICA facility in San Diego and our lab. Also, from an organizational standpoint, we have to thank Rene for his vision and support of this from the beginning. Erhard, amazing support from him as well. Troy, the Director of Sales. Jason, as you heard from the CEO. Thomas and Lindsay for their support over the past couple of years. To you for all coming out here during the ACS meeting. We've got plenty of activities for the remainder of the day, a lot of great lectures if you want to stick around, and of course, a huge number of giveaways. So with that, thanks so much for your time. Looking forward to hanging out with you today.